Welcome to another episode of the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University. In the last episode, I asked Professor Wolf a question about the links between ideology and economics. And there, the professor explained quite brilliantly and eloquently that economics has had, unlike other scientific disciplines like chemistry and physics, an ideology problem. Namely, the fact that different people occupy different class positions, and their class positions in turn have an impact on their ideological biases. One such bias in economics deals with the question of risk. How many times have you heard in the last decade or 2 decades or in your everyday life that you don't get anything if you don't take a risk? In other words, the reason why we have so much inequality, the reason why capitalists make so much money is because they take and assume risk. In this particular episode, I'm going to ask Professor Wolf some questions pertaining to the risk theory of profit. Professor Wolf, how are you today?
Okay. But I want you to know I'm taking an enormous risk talking to you.
I love it. So, Professor, just diving straight into it. In the theories of surplus value, Marx criticizes Adam Smith for what he calls the hazarding theory, or what in contemporary economics is called the risk theory of profit. And excuse my pronunciation, I don't know German, etc., but Bauer, as I pronounce it in my own uh, bad way. And later, Frank Knight in the 1920s developed the idea that the reason why capitalists deserve surplus value or profit is because they assume uninsurable risk. How do Marxists react to this particular claim?
Well, the first thing that Marxists do is fall off whatever chair they're sitting on as they are consumed by laughter. Because capitalism develops lots of kooky ideas to justify itself. But the risk theory of profit is right up among the really stunning examples of what's going on here. So let me try to get at it in the simplest way I can. When a capitalist takes money and goes into business, does he take a risk? Answer is yes, he does. When the worker gets up in the morning to go to the factory of that capitalist and spend all day with bad air and dangerous machines, does he take a risk? You bet. When another worker gets up and goes to the store to get a loaf of bread, might he be hit by a truck? Yes, he takes a risk that a drunken truck driver will be there as he crosses the street. Risk is everywhere. Risk is something everybody does all the time. The only difference is most sane people would never imagine to use something we all do as the justification for an income we all don't get. That is a stunning piece of bullshit. That what you need for that is, a good comedian, not an economist. I mean, it is really extraordinary. And let me do it in another way because it'll get better. A capitalist takes a risk and opens a factory somewhere, anywhere, Chicago, doesn't matter. People hear about, working class people hear about that job. And here's what they do. They decide to take their families and move from Phoenix, Arizona to Chicago. They yank their young children out of the schools they are attending, which is traumatic for those kids to be taken from their friends, to be taken from the community they've gotten to know. They disrupt their personal lives, risking their marriages and many other important parts of their life. They're taking risks. They're going to Chicago in order to take a job, and the risk they are taking is that what? That job could disappear in 6 months. That job could turn out to be other than what the employer said it was. It might not even be the employer's fault that that happens. But the worker is taking a risk, an enormous risk. But here are some important differences. The worker in a capitalist system never thinks of asking about the risk. The payment to the worker is for the labor. The wage is for the labor, not for the risk. I've never seen workers say to their employer, I'd like $40 an hour and then another $11 an hour for the risk I took moving here. They wouldn't dare talk like that. Not because they didn't take a risk, but because it isn't socially sanctioned to talk like that. So they don't. Here's another important difference. The risk taken by the employer is one over which the employer retains significant control. An investment that looks like it isn't working out can be stopped often. But what is the worker going to do? The worker doesn't even know what's going on because the worker is excluded from the long-term strategy and the problem solving at the top, which the employer restricts to himself. So the employer is managing the risk. The worker has the risk, but no ability to manage it. All right? So I could go on, but the notion that you can look at the risk and say, I'm a capitalist. I risked something. Give me money because I took a risk. Well, if you're going to do it for the employer, got to do it for the employee. So let's do a survey and let's see how much risk was taken by this elderly woman at this stage in her life, took a job here. This person who has a psychological issue took a job. We'd spend all our time calculating the risks and what needs to be done. But those people have to take a risk. Otherwise, our capitalist will risk his capital, open his factory, and if those workers don't take the risk, he won't have anybody working there. They all have to risk that this capitalist isn't a moron who started a company making something nobody will buy. It is outrageous. Marx got angry. I'm trying to replicate his anger because it's so extraordinarily vulgar. This is an attempt by the capitalist to come up with something, with anything, to justify the profit. Because even Adam Smith and David Ricardo kind of understood. Workers produce everything. And they wondered, as honest men, they wondered, how is it that among the rich, you see a lot of people who don't do any work, and among the workers, you see an awful lot of people who have no wealth? How did that get worked out exactly? Right? And so the capitalists were always endangered by even their own family members who understood what the difference is between the master and the servant, which is real close to master and slave. They weren't a slave, but the capitalists had to come up. Last point. How would you feel if the In a slave society, if the master said, you know why I get everything and you get nothing? Because I took the risk of spending my father's money when I inherited it on buying this plantation. Wow. You'd call that a stretch. Imagine a master who said, I'm a master because mastering is a unique skill, and I am contributing my unique skill by enslaving all of you folks. I mean, we'd start laughing. Well, guess what? Entrepreneur, that's a reward for mastering. It is a hustle. It is a cheap intellectual dodge because you've got a bad conscience that you're ripping people off. And so you don't want that. You want to imagine that you are doing something noble, something good, something that contributes to society. Why? Because you're guilty, because somewhere you know you're a parasite.
Wow. So, if I'm not mistaken, what you're trying to argue is that everyone who's involved in the production, distribution, and exchange and consumption process assumes some kind of risk.
Yep.
And um bourgeois ideology works on the following assumption that the risk to assets or the risks to capital is somehow more valuable than the risk to human life, liberty, and happiness. So, on what basis and why did how did this happen that economists just fell for the following trap and everyone just went along with the idea that yeah, this makes sense, the risk to assets and asset ownership is more important than the risk to human life, because this has real implications. I mean, as you know, I grew up in South Asia, and one of the events that continues to horrify and haunts um, popular memories is what happened in 2011 in Bangladesh with the Dhaka Rana Plaza event. And when I asked my economics professors about that particular event, they were like, "This is beyond the scope of economics. What happened? What happened in it's an unfortunate event. God, may God help us, etc., etc." But
Right.
when I heard your lectures, you seem to be arguing at that time, because I heard your podcast back then. You said something which was the opposite of that this you said that it would be bizarre not to have such catastrophes in capitalism because that's built into the logic of this economic system. So, professor, because you've studied and you've been a student as well as a teacher of economics, how did this discipline that was supposed to improve human lives, etc., how did it come to be that we said that the risk to assets and ownership and property is more valuable, more important than the risk assumed by human workers, who people who can lose their limbs and life and liberty? How did this happen? Can you explain this?
Yeah, there are two reasons that this sort of thing happens. One of them requires you just to remember how every enterprise, capitalist enterprise is organized, right? At the top of the enterprise is the individual who started it, or if you like, the board of directors who runs it, if it's a corporation. And they are few in number, one person, or if it's a board of directors, oh, maybe a dozen, or more or less. And then there's an army of workers, and the hierarchy is obvious to everyone. The people who run the enterprise are the ones at the top. They decide what is going to be produced, how it's going to be produced, where it's going to be produced, and what is done with the output. The rest of the people are drones It's like the queen bee making honey versus all of the others. So the understanding that you breed in people is that those folks at the top are really unique. Wow, are they important? And do you want to admit that the importance they have, which you can see is associated with the wealth they give themselves? If you're a worker, even you want to believe that there's some larger purpose. Otherwise, is this just a throwing the dice? Is this just flipping the coin? How did those people get they? And here we go now. They must be doing something extraordinary, and that's why they're there. For example, my students today will tell me that you have to have a board of directors because you have to have very smart people running an enterprise. I then give them 400 examples of idiots who run enterprises. Where did you get this idea? I show them this is the number, the hundreds of thousands of enterprises that go bankrupt each year. You know why? Because the people running them don't know what they're doing. You don't hear about them. You hear about the ones that survived. And if you spoke honestly with those that survived, they would tell you it was mostly luck. Right? I mean, this is why. So they've invented. We took a risk. We have, I kid you not, entrepreneurial talent. Wow. You inherited the company and you had entrepreneurial talent. You and I both know that there are economics departments in which the professor who thinks he's the smartest one there is the one who got the job because he had a lot of money that his father donated to the. Come on. Are we really supposed to believe? You think it's only that one? Not the only one. Never is only one. It's often lots of them. Awful lots of them. So for me, these are desperate efforts to rationalize and justify a capitalist system.
Absolutely.
One more example, you know I give it often, but I can't resist. Kings and queens in Europe used to explain to their people that God worked through them. They were chosen by God to be the king and the queen. So you better do what they tell you to do, because if not, you're not just angering them, you're angering all of that. Okay. We, at a certain point, we the people, separated those kings and queens, lower part of their body from the upper part. And as best I can tell, it made no difference at all. What makes you think that getting rid of the CEO will do any more damage to the economic system than getting rid of the king and the queen did to the political system? And the answer, if you're honest, is you never thought about it. That's the problem.
When we study neoclassical economics, the language is really interesting. Unlike uh, you and Marxian economists who insist that we must distinguish between labor power and means of production, and then you guys make a big deal about labor power versus labor. In other words, you're very, very specific about your categories. You're very careful about which categories you're going to use and why and when. Unlike that careful approach, neoclassical economics taught me that there's something called a factor of production. Land, labor, and capital, they can all be subsumed in this one category called factor of production. And then uh, I used to ask this question, and tell me if this is crazy. Um, if we take away one of these factors of production one at a time, that is to say, I take away the capitalist from the equation, I might be insane, but I think the machines would still be there. The buildings would still be there. If I took away the landlord, the land would still be there. The same does not apply or seems to apply to labor power. And if that is indeed the case, if I'm not insane, uh, then does it follow, Professor, that as Marx says in the Critique of Gotha program, it is entirely possible that a system of workers' co-ops could assume socially, collectively, the risk associated with production, distribution, exchange, and consumption without altering or bringing down the edifice of the economy. Am I insane in believing that there's something to this, or am I thinking along the right lines?
No, let me turn it around. I think you'd be insane if you didn't recognize that we already have proof that that works. We don't need to speculate. We don't need to worry about our own speculative judgment. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain. It's the seventh or eighth largest corporation in all of Spain. It began in 1956 with a Catholic priest and six workers. It is a collection now of about 200, 300 worker co ops under one corporate heading, Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. They have grown spectacularly from six people in 1950s to 150,000 or whatever it is now. A record of growth that most capitalist firms would be jealous of. So does it work? Of course it works. Did they take risks? All kinds. General Motors and Microsoft pay money, or did at least recently, to have their scientists working alongside the scientists of the Mondragon Corporation in that city in Spain where they are based, because they want to learn the technology that they're so good at developing. Yeah, worker co-ops collectivize the whole business, and therefore showing that you can produce, you can grow, and on and on and on. At the Leeds Business School in Great Britain, there's a professor. Her name is Virginie Perrotin, a French name. She has done wonderful work comparing similar enterprises that differ only in some of them are worker co ops and some of them are hierarchical capitalist enterprises. And she's asked the question, which of them grows more? Which of them lasts longer? Which of them has the higher rates of return on investment? And guess what? Obviously, you know why I'm telling you this story. Her research shows that the co-ops do a better job. And no one should be surprised, because in a co-op, the workers are also the employers and therefore care just as much about the success of the enterprise as the employers do in a regular enterprise. But the employees in a regular enterprise, precisely because they're kept out of running it, care less about it. And if you thought about it for 5 minutes, you'd understand it.
Wow, that's amazing, Rick. Uh, Unfortunately, time passes really, really quickly because we're having fun. But guys, think about it. For thousands of years, because life is inherently uncertain, for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived in community-based, non-exploitative systems. And despite assuming enormous risks from nature and all kinds of other hazardous stuff, we did well. I'm still here, Charlie. It means that as a community, as a species, we have the ability to insure ourselves against risk. Trust me, we can do this together. All right, guys, I hope you got something out of it. As always, I'll see you all in the next episode. Take care, guys.